introduce our narrator, Michael Presser.
Thank you. And thank you, Dan, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a wonderful privilege to be here. We're going to talk a little bit today about one of the great American composers who has roots both in Broadway as well as in the operetta world as well, Sigmund Romberg. And, you know, when we look at Sigmund Romberg, it's important to think about a couple of facts about him first to open the discussion. He had the longest-running musical production of the 20s, which was The Student Prince, and it racked up 608 performances. He wrote over 800 songs for more than 60 musicals. He worked in every genre, including revue, musical comedy, and of course his forte, which was operetta. He was Sigmund Romberg, and he was born to Jewish parents on July 29, 1887 in Hungary. Now, Romberg was a child prodigy, and by his early teens he had already mastered the violin, organ, trumpet, and drums. He eventually ended up in New York with just $300 in his pocket. And he went to work at the Eagle Pencil Factory for $7 a week. To earn extra money, he began playing in various restaurants in the Lower East Side, and eventually he wound up conducting his own orchestra and instituted the innovation, which was quite unique in those days, of having orchestral music and dancing while you were having dinner at a restaurant. He worked from noon until 3 a.m., and he eventually began earning $150 a week. But in 1909, he actually met J.J. Schubert, the great impresario, and Schubert hired Romberg as the Schubert House composer. Now, the brothers Schubert really were a theatrical empire, not unlike the British one, and that is that the sun never set on their theaters. They had theaters everywhere, not just in New York, but also around the country, as well as in London and Vienna. The Schuberts started out like so many other immigrants that was poor and pretty shabby. There were 3 brothers and 4 sisters, and they lived with their parents in Syracuse, New York. The father was totally unsuccessful and an alcoholic, but the mother was very, very hard-driving, hard-working, and incredibly ambitious for her sons. Lee was the oldest boy, and he was shining shoes and selling programs in front of a theater in downtown Syracuse by the time he was 9 years old. He was soon joined by Sam, who was the youngest brother, and who became a program seller and then eventually selling tickets at the Syracuse Grand Opera House. Sam was also pretty much the golden boy of the family. He was exceptionally bright and exceptionally ambitious. The third brother, Jacob J., who eventually was called just JJ, often seemed like an afterthought in the Schubert empire. And when Sam and Lee incorporated, JJ's name didn't even appear on the letterhead. And this, of course, would eventually lead to really great bitterness between the brothers. But Sam's ambitions really knew no boundaries. Why rent theaters when you can own them? Why own them when you can build them? Which is exactly what they did. And then eventually, why bring other people's shows into your theaters? Produce your own shows in the theaters. This, of course, produced incredible financial success for the brothers, although sometimes there were also some peculiarities that went along with it as well. And maybe the biggest one was right here in Philadelphia with the construction of the Forest Theater. Now, this was a pet project for J.J., who had sent his nephew, Lawrence Schubert Lawrence, down to Philadelphia to oversee the construction of the building. But somehow during the course of the project, neither Lawrence, nor the architects, nor the contractors had noticed one problem. That was that they didn't put any dressing rooms in the building. This was a real problem, and the Schuberts had a very small piece of land in which to build this building on. So what they wound up doing was buying an adjacent property at great expense, building the dressing rooms in another building, and then making a tunnel under a public alley so that you can connect the 2 buildings. Now, sometimes enterprising performers often chose to just forget about the tunnel run across the alley to change costumes. But when news of this fiasco got back to JJ in New York, he absolutely hit the ceiling. He was furious and he wanted to kill Lawrence. Brother Lee, of course, was a bit more philosophical. He said, "I've got a brother JJ. He's an idiot, but intentionally. I've also got a nephew, Lawrence. He's an idiot, intentionally." And Lawrence, of course, is also famous for cabling his uncle JJ, who was sailing to Europe. He said, "Don't worry if the boat sinks, Uncle Jake. You don't own it." But the Shubert power as producers and theater owners wasn't always smooth sailing. As their success grew, they began to buck the Claw Erlanger syndicate, which had a monopoly on over 700 theaters across the country. Abe Erlanger, who headed the syndicate, was a terrible guy who just about terrified anybody who had to deal with him. And he felt that the Shuberts were now getting too big for their britches. This rivalry, which intensified, grew until 6 members of the syndicate were indicted for restraint of trade, and Lee Shubert gleefully testified at the trial, which they were convicted. But the Shubert triumph really was unfortunately short-lived, because on May 11th, 1905, Sam Shubert, on his way to Pittsburgh to attend a hearing in order to win another theater away from the control of the syndicates, was in a train near Harrisburg. The train sideswept another train which was carrying blasting powder. 22 people died in the explosion. Sam was so badly burned that he died shortly thereafter, being taken to a nearby hotel. He was just, tragically, 28 years old. Lee and JJ were absolutely devastated. Lee was in London at the time, and he had a complete mental breakdown. JJ, who had got to Harrisburg to hear Sam's last words, claimed that Abe Erlanger had murdered Sam as surely as he had shot him to death, and he proceeded to carry this hatred for Erlanger until his own dying days. And as a memorial to their brother, they constructed the Sam S. Shubert Theater on 44th Street and Shubert Alley in New York. And even today, there are pictures of Sam in many of the Shubert Theater lobbies as a sort of a memorial to the young man who was tragically killed. After Sam's death, Lee and JJ had a total falling out. It was a complicated situation, but essentially JJ felt that Sam and Lee had always refused to share their power with him. Even after Sam's death, Shubert Stationery still read Sam S. and Lee Shubert Enterprises. Or at least until one day when JJ had had enough, and he burst into Lee's office with his fist flying and threatened him with physical violence unless his name went on the letterhead as well. Eventually, Lee and JJ took up offices on opposite sides of 44th Street. Lee on the top floor of the Shubert Theater, and across the street in the Sardi building, JJ on the top floor of that as well. Although they would never speak to each other, they constantly communicated with messengers that went back and forth across 44th Street. But despite all this, the Shubert Empire continued to grow, and in many ways they came to resemble the syndicate which they had fought so strongly against. Generally, Lee produced the straight plays, JJ produced the musicals. And they weathered the Great Depression and ruled Broadway until Lee finally passed away on Christmas Day, 1953, and brother JJ died December 26, 1962. Now, the Shuberts produced shows to fill their theaters the way a textile mill produces cloth, that is, by the yard. Scenery, by the yard. Costumes, by the yard. Chorus girls, by the yard. And music, by the yard. And so, therefore, Sigmund Romberg was absolutely ideal for them. For example, in the years from 1914 until 1917, he wrote 175 songs for 17 different shows. Finally, the Shuberts decided that Romberg needed to write a successful operetta, and they went on to produce his first operetta, which was called The Blue Paradise. Now, like so many other shows, this show had a lot of trouble out of town, and they eventually wind up firing the leading soprano, but they were having problems getting a replacement for her. None of the professional singers they auditioned had the right air for an unspoiled and innocent heroine. Finally, the Schuberts decided to take a chance on an 18-year-old vocal student from the Curtis Institute of Music right here in Philadelphia, and thus the career of Vivian Siegel was launched. And she went on to do other Romberg operettas, and she eventually worked for Rodgers and Hart, where she played Vera Simpson in both the original 1940 production and the 1952 production of the classic Pal Joey. Though he had made millions for them, the Schuberts still treated Romberg as if he were their personal property. Often he felt that the assignments they gave him were really beneath him, but under their banner, Romberg would compose one of his 3 bona fide operatic masterpieces, and that was The Student Prince. The other 2, The Desert Song and The New Moon, were produced by others, but they would also play in Schubert houses, because no matter what you did, there was no way of getting away from Lee and J.J. Schubert. And, despite the fact with the Schuberts, the coming decade would show Romberg at his real glory, and would eventually lead to the creation of his other 2 operatic masterpieces.